Hi, welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Last week, a group of men using Kalashnikovs and smoke bombs stole 10 million euros worth of cash and gold from a van in Italy. Also in the past week, several hundred tons of gold were stolen from investment portfolios using a whole lot of paper Kalashnikovs and just a little bit of innuendo face. Oh, Stacy Herbert?
Yes, Max, there was a theft of some gold and cash in Italy. Of course, it was on its way to Switzerland. But in the markets, the innuendo was, of course, that Ben Bernanke was going to stop his quantitative easing, and also Cyprus. What was about Cyprus? Here's a quote from Dennis Gartman in his latest newsletter. He said, "If Cyprus is forced to sell gold, then Portugal shall be too. Otherwise, the discrimination against Cyprus shall be wholly unwarranted and utterly unfair. And if Portugal is forced to sell, then how can Italy avoid the same fate, or Greece for that matter?"
Innuendo face. Innuendo. Well, yes, Ben Bernanke, and the rumor and the scuttlebutt is that they may end quantitative easing. They may end this process of printing money and buying bonds, eating their own vomit, as it were. But that is an impossibility. There is no exit strategy. Ben Bernanke will never end quantitative easing. This will all end in massive currency devaluations against gold. Everyone knows that who has a lot of money. The people with the most money know this. That's why they were buying lots of the gold as it was being coughed up, puked up at the bottom.
Well, for every seller, there is indeed a buyer. So somebody was buying big time during these record sell-offs. But it was also the sense that all these European nations are going to capitulate. Somehow people think that Italy is going to hand over their almost 500 tons of gold. But of course, as soon as this was going on as well, as everybody's saying, well, gee, Cyprus is going to hand over its gold now. It's going to hand over its 400 million euros worth of gold, which was worth 330 million euros worth of gold by Monday, a few days later. So of course, they're going to have to give up more and more and more. And at the same time, the bailout costs are going up. So a tweet from CNBC, the rescue of Cyprus has just increased by another 6 to 7 billion euros, Steinbrück tells CNBC World.
Well, it's interesting that gold is a factor in these bailouts because as the gold price moves around, it changes the calculus on the IMF and these other big global banks on their ability to determine what a number of dollars and yen and euros they need to print to simulate this so-called bailout, which is nothing more than a modern version of occupation. It's a colonization of Cyprus, a colonization of Europe by central bankers. But the point is this. Gold is now being used as a de facto global gold standard right now. We're already back on a gold-backed standard. The daily price based on paper manipulation, that's not the big story. The big story is that the central bankers now have to calculate every single day the price of gold into their figurations, how to take over these countries and impose their imperial mandate, and it's already back. It's here.
Well, you're also learning a very valuable lesson as an investor because they're not interested in the dollar value or the yen value or the euro value of the gold. What they want primarily is ounces. They want to accumulate ounces, and in the case of central banks, tons. Whether the tons of Cyprus gold is going to be transferred to Frankfurt or New York. Tons of the accumulation is of many tons as possible from Italy, from Portugal, because what's going to happen is we have the end of one empire and the shifting of power elsewhere. Some say China, but it's certainly shifting east. And you want to have the most tons, not the most euros worth of gold. You want the most tons of gold.
Right. Well, look at the dynamic here. On one side are the paper bugs. You've got Joe Wiesenthal of Business Insider. You've got Barry Ritholtz over at Ritholtz.com, who are talking about the end of the bull market in gold. Okay, they're on one side of the equation. Here's the other side of the equation. 1 billion rabid Indian people almost stampeding down to the gold shop to buy more ounces of gold. I've got my money on the billion Indians.
Well, let's look at what else is happening as European nations and the U.S. and all these debt bombs explode. Wealth tax to pay for EU bailouts. Wealthy households would face new taxes on property and other assets under German plans to prop up the struggling Eurozone. So senior advisors to Chancellor Angela Merkel, these are called the five wise men. You might call them the five wise guys, as we would call them here. They have come up with a new cunning plan. And they think that because the rich can just transfer their cash anywhere, they decided, they said, to help everybody, of course, is they're going to go after assets that can't be moved, like property. Something we've talked about here is that's a very huge downside to property is it's a sitting duck there. You can't hide your mansion on the Côte d'Azur. They just take it, they tax it. So this is what they plan on doing. Instead of taxing cash, European Union governments should, in future, target property and other less mobile assets. For example, over the next 10 years, the rich should give up a portion of their assets, Professor Bofinger said. This is Professor Peter Bofinger, one of the five wise guys.
Well, I think the key word in that statement is mobile. This is why the sale of mobile homes is skyrocketing across Europe. If Merkel shows up, just take your house, just turn the key and drive away. Here she comes, let's drive away, let's go to Czechoslovakia. Oh wait, they're invading Czechoslovakia. Let's go to Poland. No, they're invading Poland. Wow, this sounds remarkably similar to something that happened a while ago. Well, anyway, getting back to assets in the form of real estate are now vulnerable, as we've been saying all along. So you've got some major threats to real estate. Number one is confiscation. It's interesting that Germany is now playing to type by becoming very belligerent in their confiscation of wealth across the Eurozone. I wonder when that ever happened again. Duh.
So some analysts say the reason why they're bringing this up is, in particular, they mentioned Spain, and there are all these 400,000 Brits, for example, own homes in Spain. And they're targeting, they think that Spain, remember, they took a huge bailout to rescue the banks. Now they think they're going to need another bailout to rescue the government. So in order to pay these bailout debts, they're saying they're going to have to tax all those properties. We don't know how much.
Yeah, right. Well, all of the major institutions like the IMF and the World Bank that are orchestrating the bailouts of these individual countries, let's keep in mind, they themselves are bankrupt. They themselves have to go borrow money from themselves, essentially, in accounting fraud to make it look as though they're solvent. But in fact, they are bankrupt. And so you do have this massive implosion happening across the world in all markets. And meanwhile, the global GDP has been revised downwards again and again and again. There is no growth.
You know, the other thing that one has to look at when you see the sell-off in gold, you have to wonder, okay, gee, is it all really getting better? Do we not need gold? Is Ben Bernanke, or is the Bank of Japan, are all these guys like in control of everything? Ex-Soros advisor says BOJ's massive easing to backfire. The Bank of Japan's huge bet by boosting quantitative easing won't turn the economy around and is instead sending the nation toward default, said Takeshi Fujimaki, former advisor to billionaire investor George Soros. So, you know, the Bank of Japan is now doubling their monthly debt purchases to 7.5 trillion yen, which is $76 billion, almost the same as the U.S. Federal Reserve on a much larger economy. So he's saying that this bond issuance is going to cause, it could lead to hyperinflation, he said, because they're also seeking to expand their monetary base of $270 trillion.
Well, Japan is the place to borrow money at 0% interest, to speculate in all these other markets around the world. That's the role it's played for 25, 30 years now. Japan has been the go-to country to borrow money at 0% to fuel all kinds of interest rate arbitrage scams and all kinds of leveraged, hyper-leveraged derivative scams. And so they're going to continue to play that role. It is acting as a black hole of debt that's sucking the global economy into that debt, including the IMF.
Well, here is George Soros' former advisor, Takeshi Fujimaki. He likens it essentially to kamikaze. So, by the way, it was 270 trillion yen that they seek to expand their monetary base, not $270 trillion, though I'm sure they would love that. Fujimaki says about Kurata, the new head of the Bank of Japan, he says Kurata's QE announcement is declaring double suicide with the government. The BOJ will have to share the country's fate and default together. There is no escape, he says, from a market crash in the future.
Well, the Japanese monetary policy is a noble form of suicide. Just like in some other cultures and religions, they have suicide bombers. They believe this is a noble form of suicide. In Japan, their noble suicide is to commit monetary harikari. And so they're going to make a religious statement. It's become a religious statement for them to commit suicide on behalf of American consumers.
So Fujimaki says that they're going to have a market crash because of all the debt. You can't have that sort of debt, he says, and stay solvent. How much debt? Japan's outstanding government bonds, bills, and borrowings increased to a record 997.2 trillion yen at the end of 2012. So just at a quadrillion yen.
Yeah, quadrillion yen. Well, this goes back to my point that there is no exit strategy from any of these programs. Eventually, when there is this collapse, then they're going to have to, as a result of this currency war, they're going to have to recalibrate all the global currencies again, like a Bretton Woods type agreement, and against gold. So gold is going to be the benchmark against all these currencies, as it has been for thousands of years. And the Indians know this, and the smart money knows this.
Now, the International Monetary Fund, I know they were out this week. They downgraded global GDP growth. For Japan, in this article, they say that they estimate the liabilities will grow to 245% of the nation's economic output this year, expanding to a sixth straight year. Now, Fujimaki says about this, things may look rosy for now as stocks rise, but should we see hyperinflation, JGBs will see a huge sell-off, leading to a stock market crash. So you know JGBs, the Japanese government bonds, they've often had to shut down because there's so much volatility in the day. So this is a unique thing going on in the world. And despite this, gold is selling off. So we do see the wild waves of friction and chaos of a new currency regime. I've mentioned that before. We have a shifting balance of power around the world, and this is part of the chaos, is part of it.
Well, last week, the price of gold priced in yen hit a 40-year high. Not a lot of people were aware of this.
Yeah.
It was this moment when the central bankers essentially pulled out all the stops and decided to allow Japan and other countries to print now a quadrillion yen or $1 trillion in dollars and euros, and to sell into the market these naked contracts that are essentially counterfeit contracts. But it was that was the signal to them. When gold hit 40-year high in yen, that was their signal to attack the gold market with hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars worth of paper contracts. And of course, that just means that the indebtedness of the world just increased substantially. That means that the central bank's going to have to print more money. That means that the exit strategy is now way, way, way into the future. It's an infinity into the future. There is no exit strategy. And the joke is that Bernanke, on a rumor that he might end quantitative easing, Bernanke will never end quantitative easing. It's impossible. It's like the sun coming up in the west. It's never, ever going to happen. He says it purely to manipulate prices. Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Stay tuned for the second half. A whole lot more.
International Airport in the very heart of Moscow.
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time now to turn to Ed Harrison of CreditWriteDowns.com. Ed, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Good to talk to you, Max.
All right, Ed, you are the macro man in Washington. We come to you for the big macro picture. You tweeted out recently the question, why are Germans poor, Question mark. Are they poor? Question mark. And if so, why? Tell us about this.
You know, there's that study that came out on household finances that the ECB released of all the Euro nations, Spain, Italy, Germany, and so forth. The interesting bit was that the median wealth, or actually the mean wealth in Spain and Italy was higher than it is in Germany. So you're asking yourself, why is it then that the Germans are bailing out the Spanish and the Italians when in fact there's a lot of wealth there? And the reason really is the way that the wealth is distributed. But there are four reasons that households in Germany are relatively poor. You know, one is that none of their public pensions are counted as part of their assets. They don't really have a whole lot of private pensions. A second reason is that in Germany, they're very house poor. Only 44% of Germans actually own a house, whereas it's more like 70 or 80% in places like Italy and Spain. In addition, you have the East-West divide. I mean, really, if you look at the per capita income in Eastern Germany versus Western Germany, there's a huge gulf still, even 20 years later. And then when you add in the fact that the fertility rate in Germany is very low, it's the lowest in the world, along with Italy and Japan, right there, that gives you a sense that households, the number of members per household, is the lowest in the EU. That's a huge factor in terms of when you're thinking about wealth per household. And the final thing is that East versus West, Germany is really still today two different countries because the per capita income in Eastern Germany is much lower than it is in Western Germany, and that definitely pulls the number down. So I think those are really big things in terms of why there's less wealth in Germany in the household sector than you might think there would be.
Right. I saw the report that the households in Italy and Spain were worth more than Germans, and this set off a firestorm in the media. And but you know, it's not really an apples-to-apples comparison, as you are describing there. Do you have a lot of worth tied up in real estate in these countries, but that real estate is now crashing. Plus, you have social cohesion in these countries is falling apart. Unemployment is skyrocketing, whereas you have very high employment in Germany. At some point, the numbers don't really tell you the picture because in Germany, you have high employment. You've got social programs that are funded in surplus. So is it really a good comparison? It just seemed like a way to rile up using the media, Ed. What do you think?
It definitely is a moving target. I think the Netherlands is a good example of what you're talking about because, you know, in the Netherlands, they have low per capita, or actually low household wealth, but they also own homes more than the Germans. It's just that they have huge mortgage debt in the Netherlands, and that's actually going down. So they're a good example of how it's a moving target. You can expect in Spain, for instance, Spain and Slovenia were the two countries in the EU, in the Euro area, that actually had the house prices were falling the most in 2012. So you know that the household wealth is going down in Spain.
All right, let me cut in here for a second because what we're talking about here I think is very important, and you can apply it over a couple of different situations, and it's really also a question of what policies do you want going forward? Do you want austerity policies, or do you want Keynesian kind of money printing policies? Now, the people down in the South with high wealth per household, they are the beneficiaries of speculation in the house printing, house business that comes from all this money that's floating around in the system, whereas in Germany, it's already practicing what you could call austerity, and the trade-off is between jobs versus speculation. Now, here we are in Britain, and the question is, with the new central bank coming in, the new head governor, Mark Carney, should they go down the austerity route, or should they go down the money printing route? It seems like the question is, do you want jobs and wages for the population, or do you want house speculators? Do you want market speculators? Do you want bond speculators? But you can't have both. You have to pick what's more important to you, jobs or speculation. What do you think of my analysis, Ed?
Let me say two things. The first thing is going back to the whole concept of there being differences and those differences not actually being meaningful. Think about it in terms of confiscation. You know, a lot of people haven't been talking about that necessarily, but if there is a lot of wealth to be had in Spain and Italy, you know, if you're talking about austerity, obviously, at some point in time, the government's going to think to themselves, really, we want to get at that wealth. That's money that we're not having access to. There's no reason for us to go bankrupt when that wealth is sitting there. I think Cyprus, when you saw the confiscation or the attempted confiscation of insured deposits, that's telling you where things are headed in the European Union. Now, with regard to the paradigm of money printing or austerity, really, I think it's a three-legged stool. It's not just about the money. It's about the central bank monetary policy. It's also about fiscal policy, and it's also about structural reform. So you don't necessarily have to have all three. You can mix and match however you want it to be. It doesn't have to be that you print money. If you have some sort of fiscal program and you're making structural reform. And the same goes in the reverse. But I think that the paradigm now is that we need to print money, and in countries that can print money, because they have the same level for their central bank and their national government, they're going to do that. So Mark Carney's going to come in, and that there's going to be money printing.
Ed Harrison, you are fluent in German. In fact, you're a former U.S. diplomat to Germany. I know you read the German newspapers. So talk a little bit about what they're saying in German, the German people, about what's happening in Cyprus. What's your insight there?
I was in Germany for the last 2 weeks just before this. I have family in Germany, and I was talking to family members. I read the German press, etc. And I think the general thinking here is that, look, it's not like everything's easy for us. We were called the sick man of Europe 10 years ago. We've had these harsh reforms. We've had a lot of difficulty. We had our East-West property bubble, and we're getting over that. But we've made the disciplined choice to crack down, and if now that other countries are running into trouble as well, they have to get bailed out, then we expect the exact same thing to happen for them. So if we're going to give some money, then we expect there to be some pain, obviously, some sacrifice.
Okay, so West Germany, or Germany, is looking at the euro as a repeat of assimilating East Germany into their economy. And this point is not lost on everyone else in Europe who believes that Germany feels it's their duty now to assimilate the rest of Europe. And there's a lot of antagonism now, like, Germany, get out of our face. We don't want you assimilating us into your economy. And Germany is saying, well, if you don't, then we're going to turn off the spigots at the ECB and the Troika, and you're going to die from monetary starvation. Isn't there some antagonism there?
There's definitely some nationalism, some antagonism. And, there was East-West antagonisms. There were the Aussies and the Westies, and there were all sorts of jokes, etc. And there still are to a certain degree, even 20 years later. So there's always going to be antagonism when you have that. But I really do think that the Germans in general, they really they want to be good Europeans. They want Europe to be cohesive, and they want to be a part of that. But the problem, of course, is that, number one, they have a certain way of looking at things, and they basically think that the rest of Europe should do it the way that they've done it. They should do it their way. And then the second problem, basically, is that the Germans of today are not the Germans of before. If you think about people like Kohl and Schmidt and these other German politicians from the 70s and the 80s, they had a legacy in terms of the war. There was the war guilt, so to speak. Today, the politicians who are running Germany, they have nothing to do with the pre-war Germany or Nazi Germany, et cetera. That sort of thinking's not there. The thinking now is look, this is 60 years later, 70 years later. This is a new era. This is a new Europe. And there's no reason for us to feel guilt whatsoever. We're the largest country in the EU, and therefore we have a responsibility to step up to the plate. Before, they were saying, no, we don't have a responsibility to step up to the plate. We're guilty. We need to play a muted role. But now there's a stronger Germany, when Germany is stepping up to the plate and looking to take a leadership role. That definitely changes the dynamics.
Well, it sounds like you're in favor of the fiscal discipline that we saw as West Germany assimilated East Germany. But at the same time, just a few moments ago, when we were talking about Washington, D.C. and other economies, it sounded like you were in favor of money printing. So is there is what's good for the goose is good for the gander, or what's going on here?
as I was saying, there are three different things. There's austerity, there is, there's the fiscal side, the monetary side, and then there are the fiscal reforms. My belief in terms of the fiscal side is basically that, especially if you have a fiat currency that's non-convertible, which is not really the case that you have in Europe. But if you do, really, you shouldn't have pro-cyclical policy. There's really no reason to target the deficit. The deficit is the outcome. Really, what you should be targeting is growth, and you should be looking to smooth out over the cycle, to have some sort of policy that allows you to have maximum employment at all times, and the deficit will be lower as a result of that if you have the appropriate tax policy.
All right, let me jump in for a second, because I understand what you're saying there. You've got three avenues to pursue, and different countries would require different prescriptions. Unfortunately, in these countries, you have different lobbying groups and different ideologies all competing to get their ideology and their policies through. They all think they have the best policy. Now, the reason I bring this up is because here in the UK, Margaret Thatcher has died. Margaret Thatcher, there's a big there's a funeral. There's a huge outpouring of emotion about Margaret Thatcher. Back in the 70s, when she assumed power, she too had all these competing voices telling her what to do. She took a very strong position, for better or worse. She took action. So my question to you, as a long-term observer of markets and countries and politics, what's your, and we only have 30 seconds left, unfortunately, but it might be interesting, the Thatcher legacy, how does it stack up in retrospect? Your thoughts?
Oh, you mean Thatcher? I think that, I have mixed views about her. I think that if you look at the UK 30 years ago, basically it was like a, completely much more socialist country. Everything was nationalized. I think that it was a positive thing that you privatized these parts of the country. But at the same time, you look at the financialization of the UK, the enormous, banking sector as a percentage of GDP. That's a huge legacy of Margaret Thatcher, and I think that that's a very negative legacy.
Right. Okay. Well, we're out of time, so we'll have to pick up on that at a future date. Ed Harrison, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Matt.
All right, and that's all the time we have for this edition of the Keiser Report. I want to thank my co-host, the gorgeous and talented Stacy Herbert. I also want to thank my guest, Ed Harrison. If you'd like to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Are you ready for the truth? Until next time, Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.
There are almost 500 tons of gold. But of course, as soon as this was going on, as well as everybody saying, well, gee, Cyprus is going to hand over its gold now. It's going to hand over its 400 million euros worth of gold, which was worth 330 million euros worth of gold by Monday, a few days later. So of course they're going to have to give up more and more and more. And at the same time, the bailout costs are going up. So a tweet from CNBC, the rescue of Cyprus has just increased by another 6 to 7 billion euros, Steinbrück tells CNBC World.
Well, it's interesting that gold is a factor in these bailouts, because as the gold price moves around, it changes the...
Also, Cyprus. What was about Cyprus? Here's a quote from Dennis Gartman in his latest newsletter. He said, if Cyprus is forced to sell gold, then Portugal shall be too. Otherwise, the discrimination against Cyprus shall be wholly unwarranted and utterly unfair. And if Portugal is forced to sell, then how can Italy avoid the same fate, or Greece for that matter?
Innuendo face. Innuendo. Well, yes, Ben Bernanke, and the rumor and the scuttlebutt is that they may end quantitative easing. They may end this process of printing money and buying bonds, eating their own vomit, as it were. But that is an impossibility. There is no exit strategy. Ben Bernanke will never end quantitative easing. This will all end in massive currency devaluations against gold. Everyone knows that who has a lot of money. The people with the most money know this. That's why they were buying lots of the gold as it was being coughed up, puked up at the bottom.
Well, for every seller, there is indeed a buyer. So somebody was buying big time during these record sell-offs. But it was also the sense that all these European nations are going to capitulate. Somehow people think that Italy is going to hand over
calculus on the IMF and these other big global banks on their ability to determine what a number of dollars and yen and euros they need to print to simulate this so-called bailout, which is nothing more than a modern version of occupation. It's a colonization of Cyprus, a colonization of Europe by central bankers. But the point is this: gold is now being used as a de facto global gold standard right now. We're already back on a gold-backed standard. The daily price based on paper manipulation, that's not the big story. The big story is that the central bankers now have to calculate every single day. Hi, welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Last week, a group of men using Kalashnikovs and smoke bombs stole 10 million euros worth of cash and gold from a van in Italy. Also in the past week, several hundred tons of gold were stolen from investment portfolios using a whole lot of paper Kalashnikovs and just a little bit of innuendo face. Oh, Stacy Herbert?
Yes, Max, there was a theft of some gold and cash in Italy. Of course, it was on its way to Switzerland. But in the markets, the innuendo was, of course, that Ben Bernanke was going to stop his quantitative easing. And